They will never cry because they hurt you. They will cry the moment you stop reacting to it. There is one shift, one specific behavior change that turns a narcissist from someone who feels nothing into someone who suddenly can't stop crying. And it has nothing to do with confronting them. Before I explain it, comment the number of years you spent trying to make them feel sorry. Because what I'm about to say will explain exactly why none of it worked, and why this one thing will. When a narcissist cries after hurting you, the impulse is to read it as remorse. Proof that some part of them recognizes the damage they caused and feels bad about it. That reading almost never matches what's actually happening underneath. Genuine remorse requires a specific internal capacity. The ability to sit with the discomfort of having caused harm, hold that discomfort without immediately deflecting it, and let it inform future behavior. That capacity is largely what's missing in narcissistic personality patterns, so the tears you're witnessing are being generated by a different mechanism entirely. What actually produces the tears is almost always one of two things: loss of control or loss of supply. Loss of control happens when a situation stops going the way they scripted it. You didn't respond with the fear, guilt, or scrambling they expected, or someone else witnessed the cruelty and didn't excuse it the way they're used to being excused. That disruption to the expected script is distressing to them in a very immediate, almost childlike way, and the tears are a reaction to that disruption, not to the pain they caused. Loss of supply happens when the emotional reaction they depend on from you, your distress, your attention, your engagement, stops flowing. If you go quiet or numb or simply stop giving them the charged response they're used to extracting, the tears can show up as a kind of protest, an attempt to pull the supply back online rather than an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. There's also a self-protective layer to it. Crying can function as a way to redirect the emotional center of gravity in the room back onto themselves. The moment you're hurt and they start crying, the conversation often shifts from what they did to you to how upset they are, and suddenly you're the one comforting them. That inversion isn't accidental. It's a well-practiced pattern that keeps accountability from ever landing anywhere. It helps to notice how quickly that inversion happens, almost before you finish speaking. You bring up something specific, a broken promise, a cutting remark, a betrayal you've been carrying for weeks, and within seconds, the air in the room has changed. Their voice cracks, their eyes well up, and the conversation you walked in ready to have simply isn't available anymore. Not because it got resolved, but because it got replaced. You didn't lose the argument, you lost the floor. So the tears you've been waiting years to see finally happen. And it can feel disorienting when they don't produce what you expected. An apology that sticks, a real change, an acknowledgement of the specific harm done. That's because the tears were never a response to your pain in the first place. They were a response to something happening to them. Image, control, supply, dressed up in a form that looks, on the surface, exactly like guilt. Exposure is one of the most reliable ways to trigger visible distress in someone with these patterns, and it looks so much like conscience kicking in that it's easy to mistake for a breakthrough. But what's actually happening is closer to a system detecting a threat to its own image and reacting accordingly, rather than a person confronting the reality of what they've done. Think about the difference between two moments. One where they hurt you privately, and one where that same behavior gets witnessed, named, or brought into the open by someone else. A friend who saw the way they spoke to you, a family member who finally asked pointed questions, a message that got shown to the wrong person. The first moment often produces nothing. No tears, no discomfort, sometimes not even acknowledgement that anything happened. The second moment can produce an intense emotional reaction, sometimes even collapse. If the harm itself isn't what's producing the reaction, but being seen causing the harm is, that tells you clearly where the distress is actually coming from. What's being protected in that moment is the curated version of themselves, the one they've spent years building and maintaining for an audience. Being confronted privately by you threatens nothing beyond your own relationship, which they've already learned they can manage or minimize. Being confronted publicly or having a pattern exposed to people whose opinion they value threatens the entire structure they depend on for self-worth and validation. That structure is far more fragile than it appears, and any crack in it can produce a disproportionate, almost desperate emotional response. This is also why the tears often arrive with a story attached, a version of events where they're the one who's misunderstood, overwhelmed, or unfairly targeted. The crying isn't separate from the narrative management. It's part of it. It recruits sympathy back toward them at the exact moment sympathy was starting to shift toward you, and it does so before anyone has time to sit with the actual facts of what happened. Recognizing this pattern doesn't mean the tears aren't real in the sense of being physiologically genuine. It means the cause isn't what it appears to be on the surface. Once you can see that exposure, not conscience, is what's driving the reaction, the tears stop functioning as evidence of change, and you can respond to what's actually happening instead of what you're being invited to believe is happening. It's worth naming, too, how much energy gets spent trying to engineer the right kind of exposure, waiting for the moment someone else finally sees it, hoping a mutual friend will say the thing you've been unable to get them to hear from you. But pinning your piece to whether exposure happens or whether it lands the way you need it to keeps you tethered to their reactions instead of your own clarity. The tears that come from exposure are still not about you. They're a data point about the system, not a resolution you get to keep. The reason withdrawal works, where confrontation and pain don't, comes down to what's actually being run underneath most of these interactions, a continuous, often unconscious test of whether they still have an effect on you. Every jab, every manufactured crisis, every cruel comment functions partly as a probe and does this still land? Does this still produce a reaction? Do I still have access to this person's emotional state? Your anger confirms it. Your tears confirm it. Even prolonged silence used as a weapon, ironically, confirms it, because it's still a reaction shaped around them. What doesn't confirm it is genuine, low-key indifference, not performed calm meant to provoke them further, but an actual absence of emotional charge. When that charge disappears, something shifts that most people don't expect. Instead of the relationship settling into peace, it often escalates first. This happens because withdrawal removes the primary feedback loop they've relied on, and the initial response to that loss is usually an attempt to restore it through bigger provocations, guilt trips, sudden vulnerability, or yes, tears. This isn't the tears of remorse described earlier. It's closer to protest, an attempt to pull the old dynamic back online by any available means. If that doesn't work either, the emotional intensity can escalate further before it breaks, because the absence of a reaction is experienced as a kind of threat to their sense of relevance and control. This escalation phase is often the hardest part to sit through, and it's usually where people give up right before it would have worked. The provocations can get sharper. The guilt trips can get more elaborate, sometimes recruiting other people to deliver them, a mutual friend suddenly reaching out to say how worried everyone is about you, a family member repeating a version of events that paints your withdrawal as cruelty. This is sometimes called triangulation, and it can feel like the wall's closing in precisely because it's designed to. Resisting the urge to explain yourself to everyone who's been recruited into the narrative is uncomfortable, but it's also exactly the moment where the old pattern either gets reinforced or finally breaks. What makes withdrawal so much more effective than confrontation is that confrontation still requires them to engage with you on some level. Defend, deflect, minimize, counterattack. All of those responses keep the exchange centered on them and give them material to work with. Withdrawal offers no material. There's no argument to win, no story to spin, no emotion to redirect. It's the conversational equivalent of pushing against a door that isn't there. And the disorientation that follows can be more destabilizing than any direct accusation could ever be. This is also why withdrawal has to be paired with steadiness rather than coldness for spite. If it's performed as punishment, it still carries a charge they can read and respond to. Genuine withdrawal comes from having emotionally disengaged from the outcome of their reaction altogether, which is a much harder thing to fake than people expect. And often the real work isn't learning what to say or not say, but getting to a place internally where their response simply stops mattering to your own sense of stability. People sometimes describe this posture using the term gray rock, the idea of becoming as uninteresting and unreactive as a stone, offering nothing for the other person to grab onto or use. It's a useful shorthand, but it's easy to apply it too literally and turn it into a performance of blankness, which, as mentioned, still carries a charge if it's done with resentment humming underneath. The version that actually works is closer to genuinely narrowing what you allow to matter, deciding quietly and without announcing it that their opinion of you simply isn't information you need anymore in order to feel steady. One of the more disorienting parts of dealing with these patterns is watching events get rewritten after the fact. A fight that clearly happened one way gets recalled a few weeks later as something entirely different, often with you cast as the instigator or the unreasonable one. This isn't usually a simple lie in the deliberate, calculated sense people imagine. It's closer to a habitual reshaping of reality that happens automatically in service of protecting self-image and avoiding accountability. The effect on you, though, is the same regardless of intent. You start doubting your own memory, your own perception, sometimes your own sanity, because the story keeps shifting under your feet. This is where keeping your own consistent record becomes so important. And it's not about building a case for revenge or preparing for some future confrontation. It's about preserving your grip on what actually happened, independent of whatever version gets presented to you later. Writing things down as they occur, the specific words used, the sequence of events, how you felt at the time, creates an anchor that doesn't shift the way memory can under pressure or gaslighting. When someone insists a conversation went differently than it did, having your own contemporaneous account lets you quietly trust yourself instead of getting pulled into relitigating reality on their terms. There's a second function this serves beyond your own clarity. Revisionism depends on being the only narrator in the room, or at least the most convincing one. When you maintain a clear, consistent account, it becomes much harder for that single narrative to dominate, especially if other people eventually see the pattern too. A friend, a family member, a therapist, even a future version of yourself looking back. Consistency on your part interrupts the ability to control the story simply by being repeated and left unchallenged. This matters especially because confusion is often the actual goal, whether or not it's consciously intended. A person who isn't sure what happened is easier to manage, easier to blame, easier to keep off balance. Removing that confusion by keeping your own record takes away one of the more effective tools being used against you, not through confrontation, but simply through clarity that doesn't depend on anyone else's agreement. Over time, that clarity becomes something steadier to stand on than any apology or explanation could ever provide, and it holds up regardless of what gets said tomorrow. A record like this doesn't need to be elaborate to work. It can be as plain as a note on your phone, written the same night something happened, dated, unembellished, describing only what was said and done rather than how you've come to interpret it. Months later, when a version of events gets offered to you that doesn't match what you remember, you have something written in real time before either of you had a reason to shape it into anything. If this is explaining something you've lived through, hit subscribe now, because in the next part, I'm going to walk through exactly how to build that calm, unreactive response without shutting down emotionally yourself. That distinction matters, and most people get it wrong. Underneath most of the manipulation, the image management, the constant need for admiration or control, there's something more fragile than it looks, an intense fear of being seen exactly as they are, not seen as flawed in the ordinary human sense everyone accepts about themselves, but seen accurately in a way that strips away the curated version they've built and depend on. That version, charming, competent, wronged, misunderstood, larger than life, isn't just a preference. It's often functioning as the entire foundation of their sense of self, and anything that threatens to expose the gap between that image and reality gets treated like a genuine crisis. This is why accusations that are specific and accurate tend to provoke a much stronger reaction than accusations that are vague or exaggerated. If you call them a monster, they can dismiss that as unfair and move on relatively easily. But if you calmly and precisely describe a real pattern, the way they contradict themselves, the way they turn every conversation into something about them, the way they punish anyone who doesn't validate them, that lands differently because it's harder to deflect and closer to something true they've spent years avoiding. The intensity of the reaction is often proportional to the accuracy of the observation, not the harshness of it. This also explains why they gravitate toward people who admire them and distance themselves from people who see through them. Admirers reflect the image back and reinforce it. Anyone who starts perceiving the gap between the persona and the person becomes a threat, regardless of how kindly or quietly that perception is held. You don't even have to say anything for this dynamic to activate. Sometimes simply no longer reacting the way you used to is enough to signal that you've started seeing clearly, and that shift alone can provoke instability, because it removes their ability to control how they're perceived by someone close to them. This is part of why calm, accurate description of behavior tends to be more destabilizing than outrage. Outrage can be framed as an overreaction, something to dismiss or use as evidence that you're the unstable one. Calm accuracy is much harder to reframe that way. It doesn't hand them material to work with, and it doesn't confirm the story where they're the victim of unreasonable people. Being seen clearly, without drama attached to it, leaves nowhere for the usual deflections to go, and that absence of an escape route is often what unsettles them most. If you want to understand what's actually driving someone's reaction, in a given moment, it helps to stop watching for the moment that seems like it should upset them and start watching for the moment that actually does. Those two moments are often completely different, and the gap between them tells you almost everything about what's really going on underneath the surface. You might calmly point out that something they said hurt you, describe it clearly and without hostility, and get almost nothing back. A shrug, a dismissal, maybe a quick pivot to something else entirely, as if the information barely registered.
Then 10 minutes later, someone questions their competence in front of others, or a plan they were counting on falls apart, or they sense they're not the center of attention in a room they expected to dominate, and the reaction is completely disproportionate to what triggered it. That mismatch is the pattern worth paying attention to.
It shows that the emotional system in play isn't calibrated to respond to harm done to others. It's calibrated to respond to threats against image, status, or control. This matters because it's easy to keep waiting for the right trigger to finally produce accountability, assuming that if you just find the correct words or make the pain vivid enough, something will click and produce genuine remorse. But if the wiring only responds to image threats, no amount of describing your pain accurately will ever activate that system, because it isn't built to receive that kind of input. You'll keep pulling a lever that was never connected to the outcome you're hoping for. It can help to picture it less as a locked door you haven't found the key for, and more as a door that simply doesn't lead anywhere, no matter which key you try. That reframe moves the problem out of the category of "I haven't tried hard enough yet" and into the category of "this was never going to work regardless of effort." Once you can see this clearly, it becomes much easier to stop personalizing the intensity of these reactions. A meltdown over a perceived slight isn't proof that your feelings don't matter to them by comparison. It's proof that the reaction is coming from a completely different system than the one you'd expect empathy or guilt to come from. That distinction changes what you look for going forward. Instead of gauging progress by whether they seem upset, you start gauging it by whether their behavior actually changes over time in ways that hold up under pressure. Reactions tell you what's being protected in the moment. They rarely tell you anything reliable about what's understood. And learning to separate those two things is often what finally stops the exhausting search for a reaction that was never going to mean what you needed it to mean. Anger tends to feel like the strongest, most assertive response available when someone has hurt you, and in most relationships, it functions that way. It signals a limit has been crossed and demands to be taken seriously. With narcissistic patterns, though, anger often does the opposite of what you intend. It hands over exactly the material they know how to work with. An angry accusation can be reframed as an overreaction, used as evidence that you're the unstable or difficult one, or met with an equally intense counter-reaction that turns the conversation into a fight about tone instead of substance. The original issue gets buried under the drama of the exchange itself, and somehow you end up defending your reaction instead of discussing what caused it. A calm, flatly stated boundary doesn't offer any of that material. If you say, without heat, that a specific behavior isn't acceptable and describe what will happen if it continues, there's nothing to escalate against. There's no tone to object to, no intensity to point at as proof you're being unreasonable, no emotional display to redirect the conversation toward. The boundary simply sits there as a fact, and facts are much harder to argue with than feelings, especially when the usual strategy depends on generating enough emotional noise to bury the original point. This is also why calm boundaries can provoke more agitation over time than a shouting match ever would, even though they look far less dramatic in the moment. A shouting match gives them a role to play. Wounded party, wrongly accused, the reasonable one surrounded by irrational people. A calm boundary offers no role at all. It doesn't invite negotiation, doesn't require them to perform anything, and doesn't give them an audience reaction to manage. Over time, the absence of drama to react to can feel more destabilizing than direct conflict because it removes the stage they're used to performing on. There's also something quietly powerful in the fact that calm boundaries don't need to be defended or repeated with increasing intensity to be real. Anger often has to escalate to stay convincing, which is exhausting and gives them more to push against each time. A boundary stated once, evenly, and then simply enforced through action rather than further argument doesn't need that escalation. It holds its own weight, and that steadiness is often what finally makes the limit register as real instead of just another round of conflict to outlast. It's worth being honest that holding a boundary this way rarely feels satisfying in the moment. It often feels flat, even anticlimactic, especially after years of wanting a moment where everything finally gets said. But the flatness is the point. The boundaries that actually hold tend to feel almost boring to state because they're not aimed at producing a reaction from the other person at all. They're aimed at protecting you, regardless of what the other person does with that information. Of everything that can shift the dynamic in one of these relationships, indifference tends to be the most disorienting to the other person, and understanding why requires looking at what role you were actually playing all along. For years, without necessarily realizing it, your emotional reactions were functioning as a kind of confirmation, proof that you were paying attention, proof that they mattered enough to provoke something in you, proof that they still had influence over how you felt from moment to moment. Your anger confirmed it, your hurt confirmed it. Even your attempts to win their approval or fix the relationship confirmed it because all of that energy was still oriented around them. Indifference is the one response that offers none of that confirmation, and its absence is felt immediately. This is why genuine emotional detachment tends to provoke a stronger reaction than any accusation or argument ever did. When you stop being invested in the outcome of their moods, their approval, or their next move, you stop functioning as the mirror they've relied on to reflect back their own significance. A mirror that's gone dark doesn't just fail to flatter them. It removes the confirmation that they exist as powerfully as they believe they do in the eyes of someone close to them. That loss can feel to them like something closer to erasure than rejection, which is part of why the reaction to real indifference is often more intense than the reaction to conflict. What makes this especially difficult is that indifference can't be faked convincingly for long. Performed calm, worn like armor while you're still secretly hoping for a reaction underneath, still carries a charge they can often sense and probe for. Real indifference requires actually having emotionally disengaged from needing anything from them anymore, not needing the apology, not needing the acknowledgement, not needing them to finally understand what they did. That shift usually isn't something you can decide to do overnight. It tends to happen gradually as a byproduct of no longer investing your sense of worth in their reactions. Part of what makes the shift so gradual is that it usually isn't a single decision, but a long accumulation of small moments where you notice yourself not reaching for the old response. You catch yourself about to explain, and you don't. None of these moments feel significant on their own. It's only looking back over months that you can see the trajectory, the slow erosion of how much of your internal weather used to depend on theirs. Once that shift happens, though, it's rarely subtle from their side. The attempts to regain the old dynamic often intensify before they stop, precisely because losing that mirror threatens something central to how they've maintained their sense of self for a very long time, and your stability without them becomes the thing they can no longer explain away. This is often the point where what's sometimes called hoovering shows up. A sudden return of charm, nostalgia, or apparent vulnerability, timed almost perfectly to whatever moment you'd started to feel steady without them. A message referencing an old memory. An unprompted apology that sounds, for once, almost convincing. None of this needs to be consciously calculated to function the way it does. It can simply be the most reliable pattern they've learned works. Recognizing it for what it is, an attempt to pull you back into the loop rather than evidence of genuine change, is often the difference between a temporary wobble and a full return to the old dynamic.